The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the sprawling fields of Wheat Hollow Farm. It was another quiet evening with the sounds of cicadas filling the air. The farmer, Frank, wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed his land. His heart swelled with pride. This farm had been in his family for generations, each crop telling a story, each corner rich with memories. But little did he know, shadows were creeping closer. Across the town, a group had gathered in secret. Their voices low but filled with an audacious confidence, they whispered about taking what wasn't theirs. They called themselves the Reapers, a band of plunderers, known for harvesting more than just crops. They took whatever they desired, leaving chaos in their wake. Their eyes glinted with gold when they spoke of Frank's farm. The fertile soil, rolling hills, and quaint farmhouse were like a treasure map waiting to be unraveled. They were sure of their victory, their arrogance blinding them to what lay ahead. It was dusk when they decided to make their move. Darkness draped over the landscape, swallowing the sun whole. The Reapers slipped away from the stifling chatter of the townsfolk, armed with malicious intent and a daring plan. They believed Frank would be too simple, too wrapped up in his work to prepare for danger. They had no idea the training he had received, years spent learning how to protect not just the land, but also his family legacy. As the last light faded from the sky, Frank finished up chores and headed inside. Inside his cozy little farmhouse, he recalled his late father's words, "Always be prepared, son." His father had taught him more than just farming. He had instilled a resilience that ran deep in Frank's veins. Outside, the Reapers crept closer, eyes locked onto their prize. They prided themselves on their stealth, convinced that the cover of night would cloak their approach. They forgot one crucial detail. Frank was far more observant than they gave him credit for. As the shadows flickered and shifted, Frank sensed a shift in the air, a tension that danced just beyond the range of normalcy. Then it happened. A crack of a branch underfoot broke the stillness. Adrenaline surged through Frank's veins. He quickly glanced toward the window. There they were. Figures wrapping around his land like wolves circling prey. He felt a chill, but he didn't panic. Instead, he reached for the old rifle he kept above the fireplace, the very one his father had passed down to him. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of the resilience he had cultivated through years of hard work. As he prepared, the Reapers were already climbing over his fence, laughter mixing with cruel confidence. They believed the fight would be easy. Frank was just a farmer after all. However, they didn't know the fire that burned inside his heart, the training he had endured since he was a boy. He remembered the early mornings spent on the land, the long days working with his father, the lessons learned not just in the fields, but in how to defend what was rightfully his. The Reapers finally stepped onto the property, their bravado still high. One of them, a scruffy man named Alden, swaggered forward, glancing toward the farmhouse. "Give it up, old man. Hand over this place and we might let you keep the tools," he taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. Frank stepped out onto the porch, the moonlight illuminating his determined face. He was no longer the quiet farmer, he was the guardian of his land. "You think this is just a farm?" His voice was steady, fearless. Laughter erupted from the Reapers, but Frank noticed something shift in their demeanor, a flicker of doubt. They hadn't expected resistance. Alden stepped closer, trying to mask his fear with bravado. "You could save yourself a lot of pain, old man." Frank took a step down from the porch. "Walk away, and let you destroy everything I've built." The tension thickened, a tangible force in the air between them. With every word, he could feel the training his father had given him come alive. Frank wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for generations of farmers who had watered this very soil, for every seed that had ever been planted with hope. Their laughter faded, replaced by a growing understanding that they had underestimated him. Suddenly, without warning, the first punch was thrown. A hulking figure lunged at Frank, but years of experience kicked in. He sidestepped, using the man's momentum to send him crashing into the fence. Reapers hesitated, their bravado flickering like a candle in a winter storm. Frank moved fluidly, his body reacting instinctively as he blocked and struck back with precision. The fight evolved into a whirlwind of chaos. Frank felt alive, muscles igniting with an adrenaline rush he hadn't experienced in years. He used the environment to his advantage, grabbing a pitchfork and holding it steadfastly against the oncoming crowd. "You want to take my farm?" he shouted, his voice like thunder. Fear seeped into the reapers' confidence as they witnessed the old farmer fight back. One by one, they began to retreat, their laughter replaced with panic. Frank, fueled by love and a lifetime of hard work, was not backing down. He called out, feeling emboldened. "You come here thinking you can just take what's not yours, but you didn't account for the spirit of this land, the spirit of the people who till it." In that moment, Frank realized he wasn't just fighting the reapers. He was fighting the darker forces of the world that sought to steal hope, joy, and legacy. As he swung the pitchfork, it felt like a dance one he had practiced his entire life. The remaining reapers, realizing they were no match for one man resolute in his purpose, began to flee. But Frank was not done. He followed them, propelled by the promise of protection. He yelled, his voice echoing against the night sky, fortifying his own heart and soul. This land was his, this fight was his, and they were not welcome here. That night the darkness brought a different kind of stillness, as Frank surveyed the battlefield, his farm still standing, unbroken. The moonlight glimmered over the fields, the crops whispering stories of resilience. Exhausted but exhilarated, he leaned against the porch, grounded in victory. But as he stood, catching his breath, he understood the lessons pressed deep within him. The fight didn't just belong to him. It belonged to everyone who had ever tilled the land, every farmer who had stood against the odds, every family who fought for their future. He looked out over the fields, knowing that while danger may come again, he had the courage and the strength to stand his ground. This was more than just a farm. It was a legacy forged in the fire of determination and heart. He was the farmer, and no one could take that away from him. The cicadas resumed their symphony, the land whispering its approval. The night returned to a gentle hum, but Frank's heart pulsed with a fierce promise that he would do whatever it took to protect his home. He was no mere farmer. He was a warrior of the soil, a beacon of hope in a world that often sought to darken the light. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over Wheat Hollow Farm. Frank leaned against the wooden rail of his porch, his gaze sweeping across the rolling fields of golden wheat that danced in the gentle breeze. It was a picture of peace, but something felt off. A sense of unease stirred deep within him, as if the wind whispered secrets he couldn't quite grasp. His instincts were honed from years of work on the land. Farming wasn't just about planting seeds. It was about understanding the rhythms of nature, feeling when a storm was brewing, both in the weather and in life. As he scanned the horizon, he noticed a dark figure slipping through the tall grass on the edge of his property, just beyond the reach of his manicured fields. For a fleeting moment, he thought it was just a deer. But then a second figure appeared, and then a third. Frank's heart sank as realization struck. It was the Reapers, a notorious gang known for terrorizing local farmers, stealing crops, and laying waste to what parents and ancestors had worked so hard to cultivate. Their laughter floated through the air like a taunt, each chuckle deeper than the last. They thought they could claim his land without resistance. They would soon find out just how wrong they were. Frank felt a surge of determination, fueled by years spent preparing for this very moment. As the shadows gathered, the first wave of the Reapers emerged from the tall grass. Alden, their self-appointed leader, swaggered forward, his eyes gleaming with greed. He surveyed the land, a grin creeping across his face as he imagined the riches he could claim. "You should have known better than to stand in our way, old man," he jeered, his voice dripping with disdain. Frank stepped down from the porch, standing tall despite the growing number of threats before him. His voice held a steady calm, a steely resolve that surprised even him. Years of training, not just in farming but in the lessons of life and loss, had prepared him for confrontations like this. Unfazed, Alden motioned for his men to spread out. "Why don't you just hand it over?" A calculated bravado laced his words, but beneath that bravado lay an unease, a flicker of doubt. Frank had faced tougher storms than these men. He remembered the countless nights spent preparing fields for planting, the struggles of droughts and floods, and the times he had to fight against the odds. "No one takes from here," Frank replied, each word firm and deliberate. "You want what's mine. This wasn't just about the crops or the land. This was about honor, about family, about generations of farmers who had tilled this soil before him. He could feel the weight of their legacy on his shoulders, and it fueled him like a fire. As the tension swelled, Frank's mind raced through years of training. Each lesson was etched into his memory. The reapers were not prepared for a counterattack. They expected a farmer to cower, not to stand defiantly, grounded in his resolve. Frank scanned the area quickly, formulating a plan. He would use the terrain to his advantage, just as he had learned to outsmart nature itself. The first punch was thrown by a hulking brute named Jonas, charging forward with the force of a bull. But Frank had anticipated the move. He ducked swiftly, redirecting the man's momentum and sending him careening into a nearby fence post. The loud thud reverberated through the air, catching the attention of the remaining reapers. They hesitated, momentarily shocked. Frank seized the moment, grabbing a pitchfork. Its weight was familiar, its form a reminder of his daily work. Alden signaled for his men to regroup, but the doubt was already festering among them. Just then, another goon lunged at Frank, and he sidestepped with practiced precision, thrusting the pitchfork outward. It was a calculated movement, driven by years of understanding both land and people. The man stumbled back, eyes wide with fear as he fell to the ground. Frank shouted, his voice echoing across the fields. "It's about survival." His spirit roared like the wind, bringing with it a clarity that neither the reapers nor he could ignore. For a moment the fighting paused, tension swirling in the air like unspent energy. Alden's bravado began to crumble. "This isn't over," he spat, backing away with uncertainty, calling his men to retreat. But Frank held his ground. He meant every word. The reapers could take their cowardice and leave, but he knew they would be back. They were emboldened by greed, and that made them dangerous. The group skulked away into the shadows as the dusk deepened, the sounds of their retreat echoing like whispers through the night. Frank, breathing heavily, surveyed the scene around him. The adrenaline faded slowly, leaving behind a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had defended his home, but it felt like the storm was far from over. Night settled in, cloaking the land with a heavy fog. As Frank moved back toward his porch, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the knowledge his father had passed down. He understood now that training was more than just physical preparation. It was about the will to fight, the heart to defend, and the wisdom to stand tall against any storm. Days slipped by, shadows growing longer and the sun rising again, lighting the fields anew. Frank fortified his defenses, setting traps and barriers, readying himself for the inevitable return of the reapers. Word had spread through the community. Frank was not just another farmer, he had fended off the notorious gang. It inspired others, reigniting a spirit of resilience in Wheat Hollow. Then one evening, as the golden sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, the reapers returned, emboldened and reckless. This time they brought more men, thinking sheer numbers would intimidate Frank. They didn't see the fire that still burned within him. "Let's take it all this time," Alden growled, his eyes narrowing as they approached. Frank stood alone on his porch, the pitchfork clutched tightly in his hand like a knight defending his castle. "You want to take this farm?" They charged forward, but Frank was ready. Each step they took was met with the seasoned skill of a defender who had trained for years. The confrontation was fierce, raw, a dance fueled by desperation and pride. Frank moved rapidly, confident and aware, bringing every lesson to bear as he fought back wave after wave of reapers. As they closed in, the power of community surged. Local farmers, emboldened by Frank's example, poured in to defend their land. They arrived with rakes, shovels, and whatever makeshift weapons they could find, ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with the farmer who had shown them that fighting back was possible. The tide turned as they banded together, pushing back against the reapers with a fierce resolve. In that moment, it became clear that this fight was not just Frank's. It belonged to everyone who believed in the land and what it represented. The reapers were no longer simply facing a farmer. They were fighting against a community unified in purpose. Frank felt the strength of his neighbors at his side. Each swing of the pitchfork echoed a shared history, a collective memory of all the struggles and triumphs that had come before. This was their home, and they would not let anyone take it from them. Alden, seeing the determination in Frank's eyes, faltered. The fear in his men grew palpable as they started to retreat again, overwhelmed by the newfound power of unity. Alden shouted, stumbling as he backed away, now panicked. Frank's voice boomed across the field, clear as a bell. With that, the reapers fled into the night, leaving behind their arrogance and swagger. The battle may have ended, but the fight for the farmer's legacy was far from over. As the dust settled, Frank turned to his neighbors, gratitude filling his heart. We stood together today. It was a sentiment that rang true through every soul gathered there. That evening, as the stars lit up the sky like diamonds, Frank stood once more on his porch. He felt the weight of the legacy behind him, but also the connection to the community that had emerged stronger from the turmoil. He realized that the training he had received over the years was not just about physical strength. It was about the bonds forged with others, and the understanding that sometimes the hardest battles were fought for something greater than ourselves. Wheat Hollow Farm would endure, not just because of one man, but because of a community willing to fight for what they loved. In that quiet moment, as he watched the moon rise over the fields, Frank knew they would face whatever came next together, ready to defend their legacy against anyone who thought they could take what was rightfully theirs. The day was drenched in sun, the golden rays dancing over the vast fields of Wheat Hollow Farm. Frank wiped the sweat off his brow, admiring the rows of corn standing tall and proud. Each stalk had its story, just a seed in the spring braving storms and droughts, transforming into a bountiful harvest under his care. Yet in the back of his mind, a nagging discomfort tainted his joy. He squinted at the horizon where shadows lurked, shifting shapes under the blazing sun. It was nothing to worry about, he first thought, just a trick of the light. Then he recalled the chatter of the townsfolk the night before, whispers of a gang known as the Reapers, notorious for plundering farms and leaving despair in their wake. As if summoned by his thoughts, he saw them then, emerging from the tree line, a group of 5, moving with a careless confidence that sent a chill down his spine. Alden, the leader, swaggered at the front, his arrogant smirk a stark contrast to the danger they brought with them. Alden shouted, his voice jarring the silence of the fields. A lone farmer thinks he can protect his little patch of dirt. Frank felt his heart race, but he stood tall. He glanced at his beautiful crops, nourished by his blood, sweat, and tears. "This isn't just dirt," he replied, his voice steady yet burning with emotion. "This is my home." The reapers laughed, the sound ringing hollow against the vastness of the farm. They didn't see him as a threat. In their eyes, he was just a simple farmer, easily intimidated. What they didn't know was the weight of training that rested in his muscles, not just the training to work the land, but the training to defend it. Frank remembered the countless afternoons spent in the barn, his father teaching him self-defense, hand-to-hand combat, and the art of resilience. Life on a farm was brutal, full of unexpected challenges, and he learned early on that you don't just fight for your crops. You fight for your livelihood, for your very way of life. Alden took a couple of steps closer, his men flanking him, each misfit brimming with bravado. "One way or another, we'll take what we want," he threatened, shoving his fist in the air. With that, they charged, thinking of no more than the spoils of war before them. Frank remained calm, letting instinct take over. He sidestepped the first attacker, a lanky brute who thought sheer size and force would intimidate. Frank dropped onto one knee and grabbed a pitchfork, leaning against the fence, thrusting it toward the man and catching him off guard. The shock sent the criminal flying backwards, hitting the ground hard. A gasp rippled through the reapers, disbelief etched on their faces. Frank rose, adrenaline surging through him. He shouted, brandishing the pitchfork with fierce determination. Alden hesitated, watching as his henchman struggled to regain his footing. The shift in the air was palpable. Fear crept in. Frank had transformed from a humble farmer into a formidable opponent. As another reaper charged forward, Frank continued to weave seamlessly between combat moves and defense. He had learned to respect the land, and now he would defend it fiercely. The second attacker lunged, and Frank executed a perfect move, pivoting and using the pitchfork to catch the man off balance. The sound of the impact echoed through the fields, a note of victory within the desperation. Then, as the third reaper hesitated, the surprising sound of footsteps drew his attention. Neighbors, watching the confrontation from a distance, gathered strength in numbers, drawn by Frank's call to arms. Who knew there was bravery burning within the heart of Wheat Hollow? Frank's own eyes widened, a shared conviction between him and the crowd propelling him forward. The reapers had underestimated him, and now they faced a united front. This land belonged to the people, not a group of thugs looking to steal their livelihood. The air thickened with courage as his neighbors surged into action, ready to defend their home and their friend. The reapers, realizing their mistake, scrambled to regroup. Alden gritted his teeth, but Frank met his glare with unwavering resolve. In the chaos, Frank found his rhythm, tapping into the training that had molded him into both farmer and fighter. He understood that true power was born from defending what you loved most. With each confrontation, his movements became sharper, confidence radiating from him like the sun illuminating the field. He weaved through the chaos, effortlessly defending against attackers while simultaneously encouraging his neighbors to fight back. Together, every neighbor who stepped forward redefined the battle. They grabbed tools, shovels, rakes, whatever they could find, wielding them with determination. The sound of metal clashing against metal rang through the air, desperation giving way to fierce hope. When one of the reapers finally took a hard blow, he crumpled to the ground and the others began to falter. Fear replaced bravado, realization dawning. This fight wasn't just for Frank. It was about reclaiming their pride and livelihoods. It was about standing together against those seeking to undermine the hard work they put into their farms every single day. Alden, now desperate, attempted to summon a final surge of confidence. He barked, but the order fell on deaf ears. His men were stumbling, stepping back in disbelief as Frank and his neighbors pushed forward, relentless and unyielding in their defense. Frank roared, standing firm. The pitchfork became an extension of himself, the embodiment of every farmer who had ever stood against injustice. He charged, leading the group forward, each step resolute, grounding them in a shared purpose. One by one, the reapers turned and fled, leaving behind their illusions of strength and power. They sprinted into the woods, their howls of defeat echoing like fading thunder. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the battlefield as the adrenaline surged through the neighbors gathered, celebrating their victory. With heavy breaths, Frank turned to the group standing around him, sweat glistening on their foreheads. They had faced a tangible threat and emerged triumphant. A deep sense of pride surged in his chest. They had come together, united by a shared cause and unwavering resolve. Today we showed them what we're made of, Frank said, voice thick with emotion. Together we defended what is rightfully ours, and this land. Cheering erupted from the crowd, reaffirming the bonds that now intertwined their lives. When they returned to the farmhouse, laughter and relief mingled in the air, a tapestry woven with the threads of camaraderie. The night enveloped them in its comforting embrace, and as they gathered for a meal, the spirit of resilience pulsed deeply within each of them. Yet as Frank sat among his friends, savoring the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, he couldn't shake the feeling that the reapers weren't gone for good. In the days that followed, he fortified their defenses, his instincts nagging him with the reminder that darkness can easily return. He spoke with his neighbors often, sharing lessons combining the know-how of farming with strategies of self-defense. The work of preparing the crops now included training sessions, practicing teamwork, positioning, and anticipation. One evening, as the sun set low, Frank stood on the porch overlooking the fields. He felt the weight of those who had fought beside him and those who had come before him. The promises of protection echoed through his mind. The fight for their way of life ignited every soul beneath that sky. In the weeks that followed, the reapers faded from memory like a bad dream dissolving in the light of a new day. Frank nurtured both the soil and the spirit of his fellow farmers, growing not just crops but resilience, pride, and strength. Then one day, as Frank worked in the fields, he caught a familiar glint of movement at the tree line. Heart thumping, he held his breath, muscles taut with anticipation. As shadows emerged, Frank soon saw the same faces huddled together under the weight of their previous defeat. It was the reapers, their energy waning but arrogance intact. "We're back," Alden declared, barely disguising his fear. The gang had returned, emboldened by the stragglers they'd gathered since their last encounter. Frank sensed the shifting atmosphere, but this time he felt prepared. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a leader, rooted in the power of community. "Then let's finish what we started," he shouted, voice booming with conviction. Frank turned to his neighbors, reinforcing their unity in the face of danger. They were not alone in this. They would set boundaries and defend the heart of Wheat Hollow together. And so, as the night approached, a new battle materialized, one forged not just through fists, but through an unwavering spirit born of training, brotherhood, and an insatiable desire to protect what was theirs. History would remember the courage of those who stood on that land, unyielding under the fading sun, ready to fight again for what mattered most. This time, the Plunderers would find that it wasn't just a farmer standing in their way, but an entire community, vigilantly watching over the fields they called home. In the heart of peril, they found an unbreakable bond, a fierce resistance that would ensure their legacy would never be taken lightly. The sun was just beginning to rise over Wheat Hollow Farm, casting a soft golden glow across the fields. Frank stood at the edge of his property, taking a deep breath, allowing the crisp morning air to fill his lungs. He looked over the vast expanse of his land, the crops tilting in the gentle breeze, the chickens clucking in the distance, and the farmhouse standing proud, a legacy built through generations. This was more than just a farm, it was his home. Each blade of grass, each seed planted in the earth told a story, the story of his family, their struggles, their triumphs. Yet something dark loomed on the horizon. Frank had heard the whispers of the Reapers, a gang notorious for plundering farms, stealing crops, and breaking spirits. He had brushed them off as mere threats, but today felt different. There was an electric tension in the air, a feeling that danger was closing in. As he turned back to the farmhouse, a shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. Frank squinted, narrowing his gaze toward the tree line bordering his land. Figures were moving, creeping like shadows across the fields. Adrenaline surged through him as he realized who they were. The distinctive leather jackets, the swagger in their strides. It was definitely the Reapers, and they hadn't come here for a friendly visit. With his heart pounding in his chest, Frank quickly grabbed a shovel lying against the barn door. It wasn't just any tool. It was a symbol of the labor he'd poured into this place, a means of defense. He had trained for this. Not just in the fields, but in the lessons of life, how to stand tall when everything felt lost. The Reapers strode onto his property, laughing boisterously, throwing casual jabs at the crops they deemed worthless. "Look at this place. An old farmer thinks he can defend his plot of land," Alden, the gang leader, sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. Frank stepped forward, planting his feet firmly in the soil, the shovel held high. "This is my land. You're trespassing, and I won't let you take anything," he shouted, his voice steady even as his heart raced. Alden raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "You really think you can stop us?" His laughter echoed across the field, yet Frank sensed the slightest tremble beneath Alden's bravado. Frank gripped the shovel tighter, feeling the weight of those words like armor. He was not just defending soil, he was fighting for his heritage, for the countless families who had planted seeds in the same earth. With a swift motion, Alden flicked his wrist, signaling his gang forward. They charged, thinking of Frank as nothing more than an obstacle, an old farmer too weak to defend his territory. But Frank had trained for this. Years of baling hay and clearing fields had given him a strength that was often underestimated. As the first thug lunged at him, Frank ducked and swung the shovel, connecting solidly with the man's side. The thug crumpled to the ground, momentarily stunned, and Frank felt a rush of adrenaline. This wasn't just a battle, it was a fight for every man and woman who ever tended to the land. Alden's smile faltered for just a second, but he quickly masked it with anger. He yelled, directing his crew. The remaining Reapers swarmed like locusts, but Frank was faster. He bobbed and weaved, each movement fluid and purposeful. Training wasn't only about physical strength. It was knowing the land, feeling its rhythms, just like dance. Another attacker approached, swinging a fist. Frank sidestepped, using the shovel to deflect the blow before thrusting it back fiercely. The Reaper fell back, his arrogance quickly turning into fear. Frank could see it in their eyes, doubt was setting in. But that wasn't enough. In a twisted way, he understood them. These men were driven by desperation, seeking to survive in a world that often felt unforgiving. He remembered the nights spent worrying about crops, about how they would feed their families. Frank knew their pain, but this was his land and he was the one in charge here. Then suddenly everything shifted. Alden, realizing his men were faltering, pulled a knife from his belt. He shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. Frank's heart raced, but he didn't back down. The fire in him blazed brighter. You think violence gets you what you want. As Alden approached, knife glinting under the sunlight, Frank felt a surge of determination wash over him. He trained for harder challenges than this. With quick reflexes, Frank charged forward, using the shovel to block Alden's thrust, deflecting it just enough to create distance between them. The two men grappled, their breaths heavy, the tension static in the air. Frank felt alive. Every instinct kicked in. This was more than just a fight, it was a defining moment. In that flash of movement, something amazing happened. The shovel slipped from Frank's grip, and he rolled onto the ground underneath Alden's blade. It was risky, an instinct born from training and battle-hardened resolve. As he rolled, he kicked up dirt, temporarily blinding Alden, who staggered back in surprise. With newfound clarity, Frank leaped to his feet and grabbed a nearby wooden beam, swinging it with every ounce of strength he had left. That connection sent Alden sprawling backward, anger mixing with fear. This wasn't just about muscles. Frank's heart pulsing with the love for his farm fueled his every action. The Reapers, now realizing their leader was down, began to falter, their confidence draining like sand slipping through fingers. Frank sensed it. The tide was turning. He shouted, rallying his neighbors in a united front. With the new resolve igniting the hearts of everyone on that field, neighbors emerged from the nearby barn, holding whatever tools they could find, ready to stand with Frank. "This isn't just your fight anymore," one of them yelled. The remnants of the Reapers turned to leave, their bravado collapsing in the wake of sheer determination. They stumbled back, glancing nervously at each other, ready to retreat from the fierce bond forged in that field. Frank pressed forward, determined to drive them out for good. The clamor of chaos faded into the distance as Frank's community rallied, defending their land together. They had fought back together, shoulder to shoulder, and won. The sun hung low in the sky, casting glorious hues of pink and orange that felt like a celebration of their victory. As the Reapers exited the field, the true weight of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. Frank took a moment to catch his breath, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked around, seeing the proud faces of his neighbors and friends, their bond stronger than ever. But deep down, Frank knew this wouldn't be the last encounter. He could feel it in his bones, the Reapers would come back. He had to be ready, and not just for himself, but for everyone who had stood beside him. Days turned into weeks, and Wheat Hollow Farm transformed. Frank was no longer just a farmer, he had become a leader. He organized training sessions with his neighbors, showing them not just how to tend to their crops, but how to stand together, how to defend their home. They shared techniques, stories, and laughter, each lesson reinforcing their bond. As the harvest approached, Frank couldn't shake the feeling of looming danger. He worked diligently, aware that the Reapers were watching from the shadows, lurking with plans to strike again. One evening, while the sun dipped low, a familiar figure appeared near the tree line. Alden. He stood, flanked by a new crew, more aggressive and clearly unyielding. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm, and Frank's heart sank again as he recalled their previous encounter. Alden called out, his tone filled with venom. Frank stepped forward, ready to protect his home once again. The Reapers moved forward, eyes feral and wild, ready for a fight. Yet Frank stood tall, knowing his community stood behind him, united, ready to defend their legacy. He could feel their strength amplifying his own, and his heart swelled with determination. As the first Reaper charged, Frank felt the surge of energy, memories of the past fueling his actions. Every lesson, every moment of training, it all led to this. Frank swiftly maneuvered, redirecting the attack, showcasing the finesse they had been practicing together. Neighbors flooded forward, that same passion boiling over from the first fight. They moved as one, methodical and relentless. The ebb and flow of the conflict echoed in the fields, sounds of wood meeting flesh, grunts of determination mixing with cries of defiance. Despite the chaos swirling around him, Frank's focus sharpened. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting the roots they had planted together, the history and heritage interwoven into every row of crops. They were not just defending land, they were reclaiming their dignity. As shadows lengthened, one by one the reapers started to falter again, picking themselves off the ground. Alden's bravado had withered. The realization washed over him like cold water. They were fighting a united front, a community unwilling to back down. With one final effort, Frank leaped forward, confronting Alden, who had become increasingly frantic. Frank challenged. In that moment, the tide shifted irrevocably. With fire in his heart and determination as his shield, Frank swung a final blow. Alden crumpled to the ground, unable to withstand the force of unity against self-interest. As the remaining reapers scattered into the night, Frank turned to his neighbors, their faces glowing with sweat and pride. They had faced down their fears and stood together, proving that courage isn't just about standing alone, it's about standing side by side. "You've defended this farm," Frank said, voice thick with emotion. "But what we defended today goes beyond crops." Fireflies started to emerge from the night, twinkling as if in celebration of their victory. Underneath the starlit sky, the bond forged in the struggle illuminated more than just the land. It illuminated their hearts. Together they had conquered adversity, transforming their fear into power. The reapers would remember this, a farmer and his friends fighting for their territory, strong and unwavering like the roots of the trees that surrounded them. Frank had not just trained himself, he had trained a community, creating a fierce alliance bound by shared purpose and resilience. In that moment, standing amidst the soft rustle of the fields, Frank understood clearly: you protect what you love, and the strength found in unity can conquer even the darkest intentions. The farm was safe, not just because of the fight won, but because they had found a way to live, thrive, and stand together, come what may. Their legacy was growing strong, like the crops reaching for the heavens, a legacy rooted in courage, community, and the unwavering will to defend what is rightfully theirs. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted with fiery oranges and deep purples. Frank stood at the edge of his property, looking out over Wheat Hollow Farm, a place that held years of sweat, love, and toil. It was a sanctuary, one he had cultivated with his own hands. But tonight something felt wrong. An unsettling calm hung in the air, wrapping around him like an unwelcome shroud. As dusk settled, Frank noticed shadows shifting near the tree line. He squinted, adrenaline rushing through him as dark figures emerged, figures he knew all too well. The Reapers. Those marauding plunderers had struck fear into the hearts of farmers across the county, and now they had their sights set on his land. "A good little farmer," Alden, the gang leader, called out mockingly, striding forward with a swagger. "What do you think you're doing standing there all alone? This is a nice piece of land you have." Frank's heart raced, but he steeled himself. He wasn't just a lone farmer, he was a man with a legacy. "You can't take anything from here," he replied, the tremor in his voice overshadowed by a firm resolve. Laughter erupted among the gang. "What do you think you can do about it?" Alden taunted, stepping closer, his eyes gleaming with overconfidence. In that moment, Frank thought back to his father. Those long summer evenings spent under the stars, listening to lessons about courage and resilience. "Stand your ground," his father had said. The Reapers charged, believing their numbers gave them the upper hand. Frank felt the flood of adrenaline surge through his veins as his years of sweat and toil ignited something inside him. He grabbed a rusted pitchfork leaning against the barn, its weight familiar and reassuring. The first attacker, a hulking brute, rushed him, thinking Frank would break under pressure. But Frank sidestepped and thrust the pitchfork forward, landing a solid hit that sent the man sprawling. Shock rippled through the group, confusion lighting their eyes as they realized this old farmer was not going to be an easy target. Frank shouted, energy surging through him like wildfire. They had underestimated him. Years of labor had not just built calloused hands but strength of spirit. Alden's arrogance faltered, but he masked it quickly. He yelled, trying to rally his gang. Two more men lunged, but Frank ducked and weaved, a dance he had learned not just in the fields but in the heart of life itself. Each swing, each parry was fueled by the memories of countless struggles, the droughts, the floods, the heartache. He pivoted, striking with precision, each movement a testament to the training he had embedded in his body and soul. Every blow was a reminder that the land wasn't just soil. It was blood, sweat, and tears. Frank could feel the energy of all those who had worked this land reverberating through him, lending him strength. But they were still coming. Another attacker swung a heavy fist. Frank ducked but caught the edge of a blow that knocked him back against the barn. Pain shot through his side, but he didn't let it halt him. He rose quickly, driven by a fierce determination. As the adrenaline coursed through him, he leaped back into the fray, ready to push back against any who dared threaten his home. He curled his hand tightly around the pitchfork, its history intertwining with his own. It had broken the earth to plant seeds of hope, and now it would defend against the invaders trying to uproot everything he stood for. Frank felt alive, each move instinctual. As he blocked another attack, he caught sight of Alden, wild-eyed and relentless. The leader was desperate now. Alden spat, frustration spilling over. Frank shook his head. He pushed himself forward, his heart beating like a war drum. The Reapers were faltering. Their confidence crumbled as they witnessed his unwavering spirit. They had thought they could simply intimidate the farmer, but they underestimated not only Frank's training but also the land itself. Every inch of it was alive with history and resilience, years of facing storms and triumphing over adversity. Frank pivoted again, using the pitchfork to leverage himself, sending another attacker sprawling into the dirt. One by one, the Reapers began to retreat, hesitating before locking eyes with Frank. He stood resolute, sweat mingling with the dirt of his fields, eyes blazing with fierce defiance. Alden felt the shift. The bravado in his stance wavered. "This isn't over," he shouted, raising his voice, trying to rally what was left of his men. Frank shouted back, watching as Alden scrambled to gather the others, retreating into the darkness of the woods. The adrenaline slowly ebbed, leaving Frank breathless yet victorious. It was a hard-fought battle, but he had defended his home, not just as a farmer but as a protector of his legacy. As shadows deepened, the weight of what he'd accomplished settled on him. His heart slowed and the realization sank in. He wasn't alone in this fight. The townsfolk who had gathered at the edges of the property, friends, neighbors, had stood with him, and that was a powerful thing. Together they had forged a bond that held the promise of more battles to come. Days turned into a week, and the aftermath of the confrontation still lingered in the air. Frank fortified his property, setting up guards and training with his neighbors. They shared stories, techniques, and laughter, fueled by the collective memory of their fight. There was a new spirit among the townsfolk, a renewed determination to stand their ground against any future threats. They practiced together, sharing not just how to plant crops but how to defend what they loved most. As he watched them come together, Frank's heart filled with hope. But even with that hope, a nagging worry remained at the back of his mind. He knew the Reapers wouldn't stay down for long. One moonlit night, while the crickets sang their evening chorus, Frank stood by his porch. He could sense that the calm before a storm had returned. He knew they would attack again, perhaps with numbers or with a sharper strategy. He had to be prepared. The following day, as he returned from the market, he spotted movement at the edge of his property. A shadow moved through the trees, too sluggish for the usual wildlife. Then from behind the tall grass, Alden emerged again, this time with more men at his side. Their faces were twisted in malicious glee, and Frank's heart sank slightly. Alden taunted, squaring his shoulders. Frank clenched his jaw. "This isn't just a fight for you, this is about us." And just as he spoke those words, his neighbors emerged from different angles, uniting around him. What had once been a place of singular effort was now a collective force, standing strong together. "Leave now and we won't retaliate," Frank called out, the pitchfork gripped firmly in his hand. Laughter erupted from the Reapers. Alden yelled defiantly, brandishing a knife. Frank stepped forward, steady and calm. And then, without warning, the first Reaper lunged. Those charged instincts kicked in once more for Frank. He moved quickly, sidestepping and using the pitchfork with ease, thrusting it forward. The Reapers faltered, their numbers diminished by surprise. Frank had trained alongside his neighbors, channeling the spirit of resilience that raced through their veins. This was not just a battle, it was a demonstration of their unity, a swath of courage unstrung under the moonlight. The fight surged around them, the clang of metal against metal resonating like a primal symphony. Frank moved fluidly, rallying with each strike, with every block, showcasing not just his skills but the power of the bond they had forged. As the Reapers began to retreat once more, the tide had shifted. What had initially been a few farmers standing against a gang now became a collective force, resolute in their purpose. Frank shouted, wielding the pitchfork like a champion, his voice echoing across the land. The shadows began to recede as the Reapers stumbled back into the trees, grumbling curses filled with threats of a return. Frank finally allowed himself a moment to breathe, and it washed over him like waves crashing on the shore. His community had come together again, standing not just for land or crops but for each other. "We defended our home," Frank said, a slow smile breaking across his face. The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound reverberating through the night air. They had faced another threat and emerged victorious, unyielding in the face of adversity. Under that starry sky, their spirits rose, buoyed by what they had accomplished. The winds whispered promises of change. Frank gazed out over the fields, knowing the battle was far from over. They would have to stay vigilant, ready for whatever tricks the Reapers had left up their sleeves. But the courage and training had woven a tapestry of strength among them, growing richer with every confrontation. As they gathered, sharing stories and laughter, Frank understood that the essence of perseverance was not merely fighting. It was cultivating community, nurturing bonds that could withstand any storm. Wheat Hollow Farm would thrive as long as they faced challenges together, strong and steadfast. They were not merely farmers, they were warriors of the soil, defenders of their legacy. In the heart of every battle fought together, they had forged something unbreakable. The land was not just theirs. It was a canvas painted with the courage, strength, and love of all those who had stood up, fought back, and claimed their place in the enduring story of Wheat Hollow Farm. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the vast stretches of Wheat Hollow Farm. Frank wiped his brow, the sweat mingling with the dirt on his hands a badge of honor after a long day's work. The fields were alive with the rich aroma of freshly turned soil, and as he glanced over the rows of crops, he felt a surge of pride in what he had built. This farm was more than land. It was a legacy, a promise made to his family and ancestors. But beneath the tranquility, a warmth of danger flickered in the back of his mind. Rumors had been swirling through the town about a gang called the Reapers, a group of plunderers who took what they wanted without a second thought. By now, their reputation for chaos had cast a shadow over every farmer in the area, filling them with unease. Frank thought he could ignore it, burying himself in the earthy pleasures of farming, but the knot in his stomach suggested otherwise. Just as Frank turned to head inside, a burst of laughter erupted from beyond the tree line. His heart sank as he silenced his instinct to hide. There they were, figures slinking toward his property, their silhouettes flickering in the evening light. The Reapers. Their leather jackets glistened in the fading sun as they strutted toward him, bold and brash. Yelled Alden, the gang's leader, swaggering forward. "This is a nice patch of land you've got here." Frank's heart raced, but he stood firm, gripping the shovel handle that leaned against the porch. "You're not welcome here," he replied, his voice steady, echoing with a promise that resonated deep within him. Alden chuckled, brushing off Frank's words like a pesky fly. "And what do you think you can do about it? You're just one man in a field." Frank remembered his father's voice in his mind. It was time to stand his ground. "I won't let you take anything. This land belongs to me and my family," Frank said, stepping forward a bit, the shovel gripped tightly in his hands. Suddenly, a hulking figure charged at him like a bull. Frank sidestepped quickly, the adrenaline fueling his movements. The Reaper stumbled past him, unaware of the mistake he'd made. Frank swung the shovel, striking the man across the back, sending him crashing to the ground. A jolt of shock rippled through the gang. Alden's smirk faltered. He exclaimed, disbelief dawning on him. Frank could feel the change in momentum. They hadn't expected resistance. Frank challenged, energy coursing through him. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was defending the very essence of what this farm meant. Another thug lunged, fists swinging wildly, intent on taking Frank down. But training from years of hard labor provided him clarity. He ducked, pivoting smoothly. With the shovel still in hand, he thrust it upwards, catching the assailant off guard. The man grunted as he fell back, panic flickering in his eyes. The Reapers were hesitating now, their bravado melting away under the weight of Frank's fierce defense. Alden's last fragment of confidence snapped away. "You think you can stop us?" Frank stared Alden down, breathing deeply to center himself. "You have no idea what you're up against." With a growl, Alden ordered his men to charge again, desperation mingling with fury. The remaining gang members lunged hastily, believing sheer numbers would overwhelm the farmer, but Frank had trained for this. Every day spent hauling bales of hay, every moment watching how the land responded, it all lent him a grit that made him unyielding now. As the fight surged on, Frank felt his body move almost instinctively, the pitchfork now an extension of his will. He blocked their attacks and countered swiftly. Amidst the chaos, he spotted a hammer on the ground, reaching for it in a fluid motion. With one deft strike, he knocked another thug down, the clatter of metal hitting the dirt echoing through the air. Alden's bravado was now just a mask for fear. Panic rippled through the Reapers as they stumbled backward, eyes wide as they began to realize they had underestimated the farmer. Frank shouted for his neighbors, rallying the spirit they had found together. "Help me," he yelled. And as the words left his lips, more farmers emerged from behind the trees, armed with anything they could find: a pitchfork, tools, a resolute spirit. They wouldn't let Frank face this fight alone. With renewed courage, Frank charged forward alongside his allies. Together, they pushed the Reapers back, a wave of unity crashing into the chaos. Each swing of the hammer, each thrust of the pitchfork became a testament to their lives intertwined with the land. They fought not for themselves, but for the community they had built over the years. Alden bellowed in frustration, desperately trying to rally his remaining men. But they were falling like dominoes, fear evaporating their resolve. Frank, fueled by the memories of every farmer before him, pressed on. As the tide of battle raged, Frank felt like he was channeling the spirit of every stubborn soul who had ever fought for their home. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they fought, an earthy rhythm that matched the pulse of their hearts. The Reapers finally broke. They turned and fled into the thicket, their cries echoing in the night. Frank felt a rush of victory wash over him as he stood tall amidst his friends and neighbors, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. They had protected their land, fought for what mattered. Pride surged in his chest as he turned to face his community. "Together, we've shown them that we won't back down," Frank declared, his voice ringing with newfound strength. Cheers erupted from his neighbors, the air thick with exhilaration. They gathered around Frank, celebrating their victory against the Reapers. A shared bond deepened through the fight. Laughter and relief filled the air as they realized they were not just fighting for land. They were defending a way of life, a legacy worth preserving. Yet deep down, Frank knew this wasn't the end. The Reapers wouldn't stay down for long. They were a force fueled by desperation. Sleep would be hard to come by, but he felt invigorated by the lessons learned and the warriors he had fought beside. In the weeks following the confrontation, Frank honed their defenses, training tirelessly with his neighbors. They met each evening on the farmstead, growing stronger together, practicing skills not just for farming but for protecting their way of life. Frank encouraged them, sharing stories of resilience, of the unwavering spirit that burns in a farmer's heart. Hard work was nothing compared to the common bond they now shared. Trust deepened. They understood that the greatest strength often lies in numbers. But the shadows of the Reapers loomed nearby. Frank's instincts warned him that another storm was brewing. He could feel it in his bones. Sure enough, late one night, whispers scattered through the town like wind carrying dark omens. The Reapers were planning to return, this time under the cover of darkness. Frank gathered his neighbors again, hearts racing with apprehension. "We must be ready. If they think they can catch us off guard, they're mistaken," he said, eyes glinting with resolve. That night, as shadows danced around the barn, Frank set up watch. The stars twinkled like old friends shrouded in secrecy. A chill hung in the air as tension gradually climbed. Every rustle of leaves made their hearts leap. Then, just as the moon reached its zenith, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps cutting through the silence, stealthy and deliberate. Frank's breath caught in his throat as the shadows shifted near the tree line. It was them. Frank whispered fiercely, signaling to his neighbors, eyes wide with determination. Each farmer gripped their makeshift weapons, steeling themselves for the impending assault. The reapers surged forward, emboldened by their numbers. Alden emerged, a snarl twisted on his face. He shouted, his voice dripping with malice. Frank roared back, grounding himself. As the attackers barreled forward, Frank and his neighbors fought side by side, instincts honed from the previous encounter guiding their movements. Shovels and pitchforks danced in the air, merging into a unified front. The weight of history bore down on them as they echoed the struggles of farmers who had come before. The night erupted into chaos, but this time they were prepared. Every blow struck was filled with a fierce commitment to not just protect land, but to honor the spirit of those who had sowed before them. Alden fumed with anger, swinging his knife, but Frank ducked and rolled, raising a pitchfork in defense. They locked eyes, a stark battle between desperation and determination. Frank felt every fiber of his being ignite with purpose, knowing he needed to rally his friends to open the way for unity. He shouted, remembering the lessons learned in sweat and resilience. The reapers, once so bold, now hesitated at the sight of the farmers' unwavering resolve. With each swing, the tide shifted. The reapers began to retreat, the fear knocking the bravado out of them. "We'll regroup," Alden muttered, panic rising in his voice. "You make it sound like a threat," Frank panted, surging forward, fighting to retain control. As the reapers fled into the night, Frank stood tall, breathing heavily as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. He turned to his neighbors, relief flooding through him. "We've done it again." The air buzzed with the joy of victory, laughter spilling forth as they embraced one another, hearts brimming with pride. They had come together to defend not just their land, but the spirit of community thriving within it. That night, under a blanket of stars, Frank understood something profound. It wasn't merely enough to protect the crops. They had cultivated bonds stronger than any threat that could come their way. The power of unity had triumphed again, and in that moment, he felt an unshakable sense of purpose. Each farmer left the battlefield not just with bruises, but with a fervent commitment to stand together, to face any future threat as one. Wheat Hollow was not just a piece of land anymore. It was a sanctuary of strength, resilience, and unwavering spirit, a symbol of their shared struggles and triumphs. They would defend their home as long as they stood together, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. What had once felt like a lonely fight had transformed into a rallying cry, where the heartbeats of many harmonized into a single force against darkness. As dawn broke over the fields, a new day began, filled with promise. The sun rose to meet their unwavering resolve, illuminating not just the crops but the united spirit that bloomed endlessly within Wheat Hollow Farm. Each farmer looked toward the future, knowing they had the strength to defend what was theirs, come rain or shine. Because together they could face any storm. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a darkening sky stretched out like a canvas painted with fiery reds and deep purples. It was a familiar sight at Wheat Hollow Farm, where Frank stood surveying his land. But tonight, something felt different. An unsettling tension clung to the air, whispering warnings that tickled the back of his mind. Frank remembered the stories that had rippled through his small town tales of the Reapers, a gang notorious for plundering farms. They had descended upon the county like a storm, stealing not just crops but dreams and security. Most people were too afraid to stand against them, but Frank wasn't most people. This farm had been in his family for generations, a symbol of hard work and sacrifice. As darkness crept in, a rustle in the underbrush caught his ear. Frank's heart pounded loudly in his chest. He squinted, just in time to see shadows moving toward the fence. There they were, the Reapers, 5 figures clad in leather jackets, slinking in like wolves preparing to pounce. Frank felt a mix of dread and determination wash over him. Alden, the gang's leader, called out, swaggering forward with a menacing grin. It's a lovely farm you have." The mocking tone dripped with menace, sending shivers down Frank's spine. Frank tightened his grip on the shovel he had been using earlier, its weight grounding him in reality. "You're not welcome here," he declared, voice steady yet filled with the ferocity of a storm. Alden's laughter echoed out, cruel and taunting. "And what are you going to do about it?" With the corner of his eye, Frank could see a massive figure lumbering toward him, fists raised. Instinct kicked in, a response honed from years of hard work. He sidestepped, thrusting the shovel into the man's gut. The thug staggered back, surprise painted on his face. The sight of his opponent falling made the other Reapers hesitate, and Frank felt a rush of adrenaline. He bellowed, his voice booming across the twilight. Alden's bravado cracked, but he masked it quickly. He shouted, spurring his crew into action. Suddenly, they all charged, thinking numbers would secure their victory. But what they didn't realize was that Frank had trained for adversity long before these men arrived on his property. Years spent working the land had made him strong and resourceful, both physically and mentally. The fight unfolded like a chaotic ballet, Frank ducking and weaving, sidestepping violent fists aimed at him. He swung the shovel with the ferocity of a storm, crashing into one assailant, sending him tumbling headfirst into the dirt. A swell of energy surged through his veins. He wasn't just defending property, he was protecting a legacy that meant everything to him. Each strike was propelled by memories of his parents working the same land, the stories etched in their faces reflected in his determination. "Come on," he taunted, rallying his own courage, gripping the shovel like a sword. The Reapers, once overflowing with arrogance, began to falter. Fear started to seep into their hearts as Frank's energy surged. Alden screeched, but uncertainty clawed at the edges of his voice. Frank turned to glance at the neighboring fields. He needed help. This was more than just his fight, it was about all of them. He shouted, hoping to awaken the spirit of the farmers nearby. And as if summoned by his words, a group emerged from the shadows, friends and neighbors rushing to his side. Armed with tools of their trade, pitchforks and brooms, anything they could find, they mirrored Frank's resolve. Fear turned into fortitude, and they surged forward as one. United, their collective strength overwhelmed the Reapers. Frank felt the fire of community merge with his own. Alden's men began to back away, and frustration twisted the leader's face as he shouted commands that never reached their ears. They were dispersing, crumbling under the weight of their collective fear. With renewed determination, Frank turned to face Alden for a final stand. Alden, realizing the tide had turned, called for a retreat. He yelled, scrambling to escape as his men stumbled back into the trees. As they disappeared into the darkness, a symphony of cheers erupted among Frank's neighbors. They had done it. Together, they turned panic into victory, the bond forged by the fire of conflict shining brighter than ever before. Frank took a moment to soak it all in, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins as he breathed deep, the taste of triumph sweet on his tongue. But beneath that sweetness lay a flicker of anxiety, a whisper that this victory would come at a price. In the days that followed, the feeling of unease grew. Frank fortified the farm, not just physically but emotionally as well. Neighbors gathered regularly, pooling their resources and skills, training together for future confrontations. They shared stories, laughter, and most important, the fire of unified spirit. But the Plunderers lurked in the shadows, plotting their return. One evening, while checking the fences, Frank noticed movement in the tree line again. His heart sank as he squinted into the gathering darkness. There they were, different faces this time, but the same glint of danger. He shouted into the night, adrenaline flooding his system once more. The Reapers advanced, eyes hungry for revenge. Frank felt his heart pounding. He couldn't let fear take root. He rallied his neighbors again, forming a wall of camaraderie and resilience. The air crackled with tension, but they stood firm as one. Frank roared, feeling the weight of every challenge that had led him to this moment. As the Reapers surged forward again, the clash of metal echoed through the night. Pitchforks met fists, determination met desperation, and the struggle was fierce. Frank fought beside each neighbor, their strength merging into a symphony of courage against the rising tide of chaos. Alden, fueled by anger and desperation, lunged at Frank once more, this time with a fierce determination. Frank ducked, narrowly avoiding the knife's edge yet feeling the rush of air as it sliced through the night. They grappled, their bodies entwined in a fierce pull of strength. Frank found himself wrestling with not just Alden's physicality but the weight of expectation, of every farmer, every person who ever faced despair. Frank grunted, summoning every ounce of strength he had. In that instant, something inside Frank snapped the raw fear that had driven him to defend his soil, now ignited into determination. He twisted sharply, breaking Alden's grasp and shoving him back, sending him crashing into a nearby fence post. Alden lay there, gasping for breath, shock and anger battling within his eyes. Suddenly, Frank found himself enveloped in the warmth of his neighbors rallying beside him. They had stood through the trials of the night, the bond forged even deeper through the battle. But as the chaos around him faded, Frank noticed a flicker of uncertainty in Alden's eyes, not just fear, but something darker brewing behind them. Just as the Reapers began to retreat, a chilling realization settled over Frank. Alden turned his head slowly, a wicked grin creeping across his face. He rasped, his voice dripping with venom. "Next time we'll come back with more than just muscle." Frank's heart raced, the gravity of the threat setting in. The Reapers fled into the dark, but his victory felt momentary, an uneasy calm settling in the stillness that followed. A heavy silence hung over the farm, and Frank knew that peace wouldn't last long. What would the Reapers bring next? How could they prepare for a future threat that loomed larger than before? As the stars twinkled weakly above, Frank felt dread coil around his heart. This night marked a turning point, a challenge that would stretch far beyond the battle they had just fought. He turned back to his neighbors, seeing the worry mirrored in their eyes, a hushed sense of uncertainty as the moonlight washed over them. Frank knew they couldn't grow complacent. The fight was far from over. The true battle for Wheat Hollow Farm had only just begun, and as they stood there, shadows of doubt creeping in, the haunting words from Alden echoed in Frank's mind, resonating like a thunderstorm gathering strength, ready to unleash its fury. Would they be ready for what was to come? The air was thick with potential disaster, and he felt a chill race down his spine as he stared into the night. The next round was looming on the horizon, and Frank had to prepare. The question remained, would their unity hold strong enough to face the brewing storm? Only time would tell if they would truly defend their legacy, or if the Reapers would finally take what they believed was theirs. The fight was far from over.